In the still, humid darkness of Ouagadougou's early morning, the presidential residence remained quiet until a secured satellite phone began to ring. President Ibrahim Traoré, the 37-year-old leader of Burkina Faso, stirred from restless sleep. He sat up, the soft light from the encrypted handset casting eerie shadows across his desk, papers filled with classified maps, mineral assessments, and urgent reports on terrorist incursions. Traoré picked up the call with silent alertness. The voice on the other end was American, calm and precise. "Mr. President," the caller said, "my name is Alan McCourt, Special Envoy with the United States National Security Council. President Biden requests a discreet engagement." The words hung in the air like thick fog. For a moment, Traoré said nothing. Washington had spent the past year isolating his government and accusing him of autocratic drift. Now they wanted to talk. He responded with the caution of a soldier who'd survived more than one ambush. Why now? Unbeknownst to Traoré, thousands of miles away in the Situation Room of the White House, Africa was once again on the agenda. Joe Biden listened intently as his national security team laid out the latest intelligence. The Sahel, and Burkina Faso in particular, had become a geopolitical hot zone. France had withdrawn, its legacy of neocolonialism rejected. Russia had stepped in, offering arms, advisors, and even plans for a civilian nuclear reactor, a symbol of permanent partnership. China, too, was expanding its grip through strategic infrastructure deals. The United States, recognizing the rapid shift, needed a new partner in the region. And Traoré, with his rising influence and anti-imperialist aura, had suddenly become too important to ignore. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood at a crossroads. The American offer, though vague, carried unmistakable weight. He could feel the gravity behind McCourt's carefully chosen words. "What's coming will reorder Africa, Captain. And we'd prefer to write that script with you, rather than around you." He ended the call without committing, but the message was received. The Americans had extended an invisible hand. Now he had to decide whether to shake it or slap it away. Traoré spent the following day in reflection, starting with a tour of Camp Giral, one of Burkina Faso's key military bases. There, among sand-worn vehicles and barefoot conscripts, the burden of leadership pressed down heavily. Soldiers saluted with tired eyes. Their weapons were outdated, their resources scarce. Graffiti painted across trucks bore slogans like "Sovereignty or Death." It was a reminder that his revolutionary rhetoric, while powerful on social media, didn't buy ammunition or repair armored vehicles. The insurgency was spreading. Hundreds of civilians had died in the past month alone. The country's economic engine was sputtering under the weight of sanctions, and traditional allies were nowhere to be found. Traoré knew charisma alone wouldn't save his people. He needed options. He needed leverage. That night, the president met with his closest circle. Colonel Kafando, his head of intelligence, Dr. Salimata Ouedraogo, a brilliant economist and trusted advisor from his university days, and Imam Issoufou Sorgo, a soft-spoken spiritual guide who had earned Traoré's respect during the early days of the coup. The air in the room was tense as they weighed the implications of American outreach. Kafando warned that Russian operatives were already embedded within the security establishment and would view this contact with deep suspicion. Dr. Ouedraogo added that while American aid came with promises, it often brought heavy strings attached, bureaucratic oversight, policy conditions, and a microscope placed over every internal affair. Imam Sorgo, ever thoughtful, said only this: "A nation's dignity is not in choosing one master over another. It is carving room so you kneel to none." By dawn, Traoré had made his decision. He would accept the meeting, but on his terms. He reached once more for the secure line, calling back McCourt. His voice, calm but steely, laid out the conditions. The meeting would take place on neutral African soil. No media, no leaks. The American Secret Service would coordinate only through Colonel Cafando. And if a single French or Russian intelligence agent was detected near the venue, the meeting would be canceled. McCourt, unsurprised by the tough posture, agreed swiftly. He proposed Accra, Ghana, a city with discreet infrastructure and a regional air base with VIP security arrangements. Traoré accepted. As the call ended, both men sat back in their chairs, staring into the distance, already calculating the next move in a diplomatic chess match unlike any other. What had begun as a cryptic 2 a.m. call was now spiraling into a high-stakes negotiation that could shift the power dynamics of an entire continent. For Traoré, the meeting wasn't just about foreign policy. It was about Burkina. Before Ibrahim Traoré became one of Africa's most controversial and admired young leaders, he was simply a student with questions. Born in 1988 in the Hautes Bassin region of western Burkina Faso, his early years were spent in a modest family home where values like discipline, solidarity, and patriotism were woven into daily life. His father was a school teacher, and his mother, a market vendor, worked long hours to support their children's education. From an early age, Traoré developed a fascination with history, particularly the independence struggles that shaped modern Africa. The names of Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah weren't just historical figures to him. They were icons, warriors of justice, models of what leadership could look like. At the University of Ouagadougou, he initially enrolled in geology, a field that suited his practical mind and love for the natural sciences. But it wasn't long before his attention turned elsewhere. As the campus buzzed with student protests over rising fees and deteriorating conditions, Traoré began speaking out. His voice, calm and unwavering, earned him respect among his peers. He quoted Sankara frequently, reminding fellow students that he who feeds you controls you. By his second year, Traoré was known as more than a student. He was an organizer, a thinker, a leader in the making. However, it was in the military that he would find his true platform. Joining the armed forces in his mid-20s, Traoré's technical background and strategic mind quickly earned him a place in elite units. He rose through the ranks with speed, but not without friction. He refused bribes, turned down assignments that conflicted with his values, and often clashed with superiors who favored political obedience over professional competence. Those who served with him described a man of iron principles, blunt, incorruptible, and fiercely committed to national sovereignty. By the time the security situation in Burkina Faso began to deteriorate under President Roch-Marc Kabore, Traoré was already commanding respect among junior officers. Jihadist attacks in the north and east of the country were increasing rapidly, while the government seemed paralyzed. Villages were being wiped out, schools shut down, and hundreds of thousands displaced. Frustrated and heartbroken, Traoré began convening informal strategy meetings with fellow officers to discuss what they viewed as a betrayal of the nation by its leaders. What started as concern turned into quiet defiance. and eventually into action. On September 30th, 2022, Traoré led a bloodless coup that ousted Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, who himself had seized power just 8 months earlier. The people of Burkina Faso, worn down by cycles of insecurity and broken promises, flooded the streets in support of Traoré. Many saw in him not just a new leader, but a reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who led the country in the 1980s before being assassinated in a coup many believe was backed by foreign interests. In the days that followed, Traoré made it clear that his priority was restoring security and dignity. He vowed to kick out foreign military bases if they didn't produce results. "We will not be the pawns of any power," he declared. "Burkina Faso must stand for itself." That uncompromising message resonated far beyond the borders of his landlocked nation. Young Africans across the Sahel and beyond began holding up his image at protests. Social media channels filled with short videos of him meeting barefoot villagers, speaking plainly in local languages, and criticizing the neo-colonial grip of France and the West. But it wasn't just rhetoric. Traoré followed through. He expelled French troops, ended military cooperation with Paris, and turned instead to Russia for arms and training, triggering a wave of diplomatic isolation from the West. The global press quickly took sides. Western media painted him as a dangerous populist, flirting with authoritarianism, and putting his country at risk by cozying up to Russia. Others, particularly African diaspora outlets, hailed him as the bold leader the continent had been waiting for. He was young, unbought, and most importantly, unafraid to challenge the status quo. In a world where many African leaders prioritized international approval over domestic empowerment, Traoré was a stark contrast. But behind the bravado, Traoré was aware of the cost. Burkina Faso was now sanctioned, its economy teetering, and its army stretched thin. His bold pivot to Russia had gained him weapons, but not peace. The insurgency raged on. In quiet moments, Traoré studied maps alone in his office, marking new attacks with red pins. His aides noticed he spoke less, observed more, and rarely slept. The weight of leadership was settling in. When the United States called unexpectedly, it was not lost on Traoré that Washington was making a calculated move. He understood power. Thousands of miles away from the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, another kind of storm was brewing inside the White House. In a windowless room deep beneath the West Wing, the famed Situation Room, a special task force had been assembled. The topic, West Africa and strategic realignment. On the wall, digital screens showed maps of the Sahel lit up with red zones, terrorist activity, Russian military outposts, Chinese-funded infrastructure. Burkina Faso was at the center of it all. At the head of the table sat President Joe Biden, his expression grave as his national security advisors laid out the facts. The question wasn't whether the United States could afford to engage with Africa. It was whether it could afford not to. The 2000s had not been kind to U.S. influence on the continent. China's Belt and Road Initiative had built hundreds of roads, railways, and ports across Africa, turning Beijing into a dominant economic player. Russia, once a Cold War ghost, was now very much alive, supplying arms, military training, and political support to regimes that felt abandoned by the West. And France, long considered the default Western power in Francophone Africa, was rapidly losing legitimacy after years of accusations of exploitation and interference. In this vacuum, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré were rising, young, bold, and unafraid to reject old alliances. For Washington, the stakes were more than just geopolitical theater. Africa was becoming increasingly central to the world's future. Its population was booming. Its mineral resources, including gold, cobalt, and rare earth elements, were critical to the global tech and green energy industries. And its location, especially the Sahel, was a corridor of influence between the Middle East, North Africa, and the Atlantic. If the U.S. failed to maintain a presence in this region, it wouldn't just be losing a strategic foothold. It would be surrendering the future to rival powers. That's why President Biden, who had campaigned on restoring American leadership globally, was now paying close attention to Burkina Faso. It was, in many ways, a test case. If the United States could build a new relationship with a leader like Traoré, without the heavy-handedness of past interventions, it could set a new tone for U.S.-Africa relations. One rooted in mutual respect, not dominance. But that was easier said than done. The challenge was layered. First, there was the issue of credibility. For decades, the U.S. had made promises to African nations, support, investment, security partnerships that often came with conditions or were delayed by bureaucracy. Leaders like Traoré were deeply skeptical. They saw America's actions through the lens of Libya, Iraq, and decades of meddling in African affairs. Second, there was the optics. Biden had to tread carefully. Openly embracing a military leader who came to power via a coup could damage his image among allies and human rights advocates. But ignoring Traoré meant pushing him further into Moscow's embrace. In this diplomatic maze, one figure emerged as a bridge: Alan McCourt, a seasoned U.S. envoy with decades of experience in Africa. Fluent in French and several African dialects, McCourt had served in Chad, Senegal, and Nigeria. He understood the cultural nuances and political sensitivities of the region. He was the one who made the initial call to Traoré. His role now was to arrange the secret meeting and shape the American offer. That offer, however, was still being crafted. The National Security Council proposed a multi-pronged package: security cooperation to help fight jihadist groups, economic support for infrastructure development, and investment in Burkina Faso's mining sector. But there were strings: transparency, gradual political reforms, and a clear break from Russian paramilitary involvement. It was a delicate balance, offering enough to appeal to Traoré's pragmatic side, but not so much that it triggered backlash at home or among African allies who feared a return to Western control. Biden, who had personally followed reports of Traoré's anti-imperialist speeches, asked a key question during the meeting: is this a man we can work with? Or is he just another populist riding a wave? McCourt's answer was careful but clear. He's principled, but not inflexible. He wants respect more than money. If we offer dignity alongside support, we may have a chance. The president nodded, weighing the implications. Then we need to show him this isn't 1985. We're not here to own Africa. We're here to partner, on their terms, not just ours. The final decision was made. The U.S. would proceed with the meeting using Accra, Ghana, as neutral ground. Biden would not attend personally, but McCourt would carry a signed letter outlining the administration's commitment to mutual cooperation. It was a symbolic gesture, one that Biden hoped would resonate with a leader who valued sovereignty above all else. The private jet touched down on the tarmac of Kotoka International Airport under the cover of darkness. No flashing lights, no red carpets, no media spectacle. Just 3 armored vehicles waiting discreetly at the edge of the runway. Accra, the capital of Ghana, was chosen for its neutrality, a quiet diplomatic hub known for hosting delicate regional negotiations. It was here, far from the eyes of world press and intelligence agencies, that 2 radically different worlds would collide. Ibrahim Traoré, the revolutionary soldier president of Burkina Faso, and Alan McCourt, the American envoy carrying a letter from Joe Biden himself. Traoré arrived in a Ghanaian Air Force transport plane with minimal security. He wore a simple khaki uniform and no insignia of rank. His presence was quiet but commanding, and as he stepped onto Ghanaian soil, he scanned his surroundings like a man trained to notice ambushes. Beside him walked Colonel Kafando, head of intelligence, whose eyes never stopped moving. Their hosts, Ghanaian security officers, guided them swiftly to a secure compound on the edge of the city, a former embassy turned neutral zone for high-level diplomatic engagements. No phones, no recording devices, only handshakes, sealed envelopes, and long conversations. Waiting inside was Alan McCourt, flanked by 2 intelligence analysts and a Ghanaian mediator. McCourt, with decades of experience behind him, knew better than to start with pleasantries. He extended his hand. Traoré shook it, firm and silent. Then they sat. The room was austere, a round table, a jug of water, maps of the Sahel on the walls. Traoré didn't waste time. "Let's speak plainly," he said. "Why now, and what do you want?" McCourt leaned forward. "We've watched what you've done," he began. "You've taken bold steps to reclaim your country's independence. We respect that. But the region is changing fast. We're not here to control that change. We're here to ensure it doesn't collapse." He laid out the key points. The United States was offering Burkina Faso $300 million in military and economic assistance. This included advanced surveillance technology, logistical support to counterinsurgent groups, and funding for key infrastructure in the north: roads, hospitals, and communications. In return, the U.S. requested a reduction in Russian military presence, joint intelligence sharing, and a framework for political normalization over the next 3 years. It was, on paper, a generous offer, but Traoré didn't blink. He had been briefed on how these deals often began, with promises, and ended with strings. "I didn't come here to trade one master for another," he said coldly. "We've had enough of partners who give with one hand and demand with the other." McCourt responded calmly. "We're not here to dictate. We're here because the future of the Sahel affects global security. We know others are offering you support, some with no questions asked. But we believe Africa deserves partners, not patrons. That's why we're talking." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Traoré asked the one question McCourt had been waiting for. "What makes you different?" McCourt opened the leather portfolio he'd brought and slid forward the signed letter from President Biden. It acknowledged Traoré's leadership and stated America's willingness to forge a new, respectful chapter with nations charting their own sovereign paths. More importantly, it proposed a bi-national commission, jointly led by Burkina Faso and American officials, to oversee all cooperative initiatives, ensuring transparency and equality in decision-making. It was an unprecedented gesture. Traoré read the letter carefully. His eyes paused on certain words: respect, sovereignty, mutual accountability. He set the paper down, nodding slightly. Then quietly he replied, "This is different. But it's not enough." He leaned forward. I want your support, but I will not be your outpost. If we are to work together, then we do it on 3 principles: African solutions for African problems, no foreign military bases, and no interference in domestic political direction. McCourt agreed to relay those conditions directly to the White House. Then, as both sides stood to adjourn for a break, Traoré asked for a private word. Behind closed doors, with no advisors, he posed a question that had been gnawing at him. Why do you care about Burkina Faso now, after decades of neglect? What do you really want? McCourt didn't hesitate. Because if Burkina Faso succeeds, if you prove that a sovereign, secure, and self-governing African state can thrive outside traditional Western dependency, others will follow, and that will change everything. The world isn't ready for that, but maybe we are. That answer stayed with Traoré long after the meeting ended. Back in his quarters that night, he reviewed notes, maps, and risk assessments. He didn't trust Washington, not yet, but he saw something useful in the offer. The streets of Ouagadougou are always alive, with heat, with music, with stories whispered at cafes and shouted in open-air markets. But in the days following President Traoré's quiet return from Accra, there was a different kind of buzz in the air. Rumors, half-truths, and raw speculation traveled faster than any press release. People had seen the president's convoy arrive late at night. Some claimed he had flown back from Ghana. Others whispered that an American agent was with him, but no one really knew the truth. And in the absence of facts, the people did what they always do. They speculated. On street corners and in barbershops, the conversation circled around one thing. What did Traoré go to discuss? Some believed it was an arms deal. Others thought it was about mining contracts. A few radicals insisted it was a trap, that America wanted to recolonize Burkina Faso through diplomacy and dollars. But among many, especially the youth, there was a different feeling, a cautious hope. If Traoré could play the game right, balance the Russians, the Americans, and the traditional elite, he might do what no leader had done before: give Burkina Faso real leverage on the world stage. We met with young vendors at the Marché Central, the heart of Ouagadougou's trade. Adama, a 26-year-old seller of phone accessories, didn't mince words. We don't care who helps us, as long as they help us build. We need jobs, security, electricity. If America is serious, good. If not, they can go like the others. Outside the University of Ouagadougou, student activists were already organizing a debate titled Partnership or Puppetry. The campus, long a center for political thought, was split. Some hailed Traoré's boldness in even speaking to the Americans, calling it a masterstroke of diplomacy. Others feared a backslide into foreign dependency. One student, Alimata, a political science major, said, "This is a test. If Traoré can keep our dignity while getting support, he'll be remembered as a true Pan-Africanist. But if he compromises, we'll protest. He knows that." In the rural areas, where foreign aid often meant the difference between life and death, the sentiment was more grounded. In the village of Dédougou, an elder named Baba Diallo expressed cautious optimism. "If this man brings peace to our region, and my grandchildren can go to school without fear, then may God bless his decisions. But if it brings more war, more soldiers, we will curse every handshake he makes." Burkina Faso's political landscape is unique. The people have always held their leaders to a different standard. Thomas Sankara's ghost still lingers in the minds of many. A young, radical president who nationalized resources, empowered women, and rejected foreign aid before being assassinated in a coup. Traoré, whether intentionally or not, walks in those footsteps. His supporters hail him as the second Sankara. But even among the faithful, there's a clear warning. Don't sell the revolution. Inside the state broadcaster, RTB's headquarters, producers debated how to report the Accra meeting. There was no official press release from the presidency, only whispers that diplomatic talks had been productive. Analysts were invited to speak on air, threading the line between cautious approval and strategic skepticism. One senior journalist noted, "We must remember, diplomacy is not betrayal. But secrecy breeds suspicion." Meanwhile, opposition figures seized the moment. One former minister from the ousted civilian government took to social media, accusing Traoré of hypocrisy. "You denounce the West. Now you dine with them in secret. Is this patriotism or power games?" The post went viral, but so did the responses. "At least Traoré is doing something," one user commented. "What did your democracy do for us except steal and kneel?" In the mosques and churches, the clergy urged prayer for discernment and wisdom. Burkina Faso has endured too much instability, coups, terror attacks, displacement. The average citizen doesn't crave ideology. They crave peace, food on the table, safe roads, a future. And if Traoré could secure that, whether with Russian guns or American dollars, many were ready to support him. Still, tension lingered beneath the surface. Traoré's base, youth, soldiers, revolutionaries, was watching him closely. They admired his strength, but they feared compromise. One soldier, interviewed anonymously, said, "We follow him because he stands tall. But if he bows, especially to the West, he'll lose us." And perhaps no one understood that better than Traoré himself. In private meetings with his inner circle, he spoke of the dangers of appearing too close to any foreign power. "We must never be seen as anyone's pawn," he said. "Not Russia's, not America's. We are Burkina Faso. We are Africans." And so the president walked a tightrope. To accept help without losing face, to partner without being patronized, to advance without surrendering control.